Today, on 25th March 2024, the big news in Russia continues to be the terrorist attack on Friday on the rock concert at the Crocus City Hall in the region, the suburb of Moscow, known as Krasnogorsk. There continues to be lots of speculation and discussion about this attack. Before I discuss that, a few words about information which has become available over the last couple of hours, which in my opinion helps us to understand rather better what actually happened. First thing to say is that, in my opinion, more information has now appeared, which makes me certain that the organization known as ISIS undoubtedly did have a role in this incident. Now, ISIS has published through the Amaq news agency various statements, one in which it claimed responsibility for the attack, another a photograph which I haven't seen, which purports to show the four gunmen parading in front of a flag before the attack took place. And I'm not going to say that I necessarily believe these. I have not, up to this point, placed a huge amount of weight on those statements or on that particular photograph. People who've seen it, some of them have raised questions about this particular photograph. As I said, I haven't seen it myself. But anyway, yesterday, a video appeared, which was published by ISIS, which actually showed the attack as it was taking place, and which appears to have been made by one of the gunmen, and which he was presumably feeding to ISIS in order to provide visual, cinematic, if you like, confirmation of the organization's role in the incident. Now, maybe it's possible to make up or fake such things. I haven't watched this film. As a matter of fact, I do not watch ISIS videos of any kind. So, as I said, I haven't watched this video, but most people who've seen it, everyone I know who has seen it, are convinced that it does show the attack itself, that it was made by one of the gunmen. It has been published by ISIS, and therefore I strongly suspect that it seems to me that puts beyond question ISIS's involvement in this affair. Now, we've also had more news about what happened, not so much during the incident itself, but in its immediate aftermath. Firstly, it appears that 6 gunmen were involved, and it seems that 2 of them were shot and killed by the security forces at the actual scene in the area of Crocus City Hall. Now, that, by the way, to my mind, calls into question the widely repeated story that the security forces delayed in arriving on the scene because they were held up by heavy traffic. So it could be that we're getting some distorted or false information circulating, just saying. But anyway, those 2 of those gunmen apparently were killed at the scene itself. 4 others out of the 6, the 4 survivors out of the 6, bundled themselves into this white Renault car and drove from the location, heading, it seems, for the Ukrainian border. And there's been a massive amount of commentary, discussion, reporting in Russia and in the West. But it's important to stress that there doesn't seem to be any dispute about the fact that these 4 men were fleeing towards Ukraine and were looking to cross the border into Ukraine. It's been striking how Western commentary that I have read seems to avoid addressing the fact, this particular fact, or its possible implications. Anyway, the Russian authorities launched their manhunt. Word went out to try to track down this white Renault. The Renault was indeed tracked down in Bryansk region. At some point, as the security forces closed in, the men in the Renault realized that the Russians were on their track. They drove apparently into a wood, got out of the wood, fled through the wood. The Russian security forces arrived in hot pursuit. There are some reports that there were dogs, in other words, that the security forces hunted these people down with dogs, and it seems that all of them, well, in fact, it is conclusive that all of them were captured, all 4 of them. Now, what happened over the course of this hunt is to some extent controversial. There are all sorts of videos, which again I have not watched and have no intention of watching. There are all sorts of videos circulating which purport to show brutal mistreatment of these 4 men by the security forces that caught up with them. I should say that I find it astonishing if the security forces really did track down and brutalize and, in effect, torture these men, as I've seen suggested in some media publications, that the security forces would themselves have filmed themselves doing that and would have published the fact in videos posted on the internet. Just saying. I say that because I understand that some of these videos appear to show incredibly grisly scenes. Videos can, I know this for a fact, can be manipulated and distorted, and I would be very careful before I took the content of these videos as being necessarily true. Just saying. So just to say this. But however, it's clear that these 4 people were indeed severely roughed up. Presumably there was some kind of a struggle before they were finally captured. One of them was knocked unconscious. Another one seems to have suffered damage to his ear. Anyway, all 4 of them, when they finally appeared in the Basmani court in Moscow, seem to have been in, shall we say, much the worse for wear. But anyway, they were all captured and brought to Moscow, where apparently interrogations have already begun. And they were brought before the Basmani court yesterday, and at least 3 of them were, and they have now been charged. Now, a number of things to say. Firstly, it seems that all of them are citizens of Tajikistan. Several of them, at least one of them, has been a much-travelled person. He has been to Turkey and to other places. Perhaps he was the ringleader, just saying. But even allowing for the fact that, as I said, they're definitely the worse for wear, they did not make an impressive impression when they turned up at the court. Now, ISIS, or at least the ISIS that I remember from its heyday, when it was the caliphate based in the Middle East, headed by its caliph al-Baghdadi, well, in those days, I think they would have wanted, they would certainly have wanted their operatives to make a more impressive show than these 4 people did. I spoke in my video yesterday that the usual promise ISIS in those days made to its fighters, the reward it offered them for carrying out terrorist acts like the one that was carried out on Friday, was not financial, but the promise of martyrdom and eternal life in paradise. Now, that clearly wasn't the case with these 4 men. Not only did they try to flee, but they were tracked down. They do appear to have put up some resistance, but clearly they let themselves be captured alive. And to be frank, 2 of them at least, from the pictures that I've seen, when they finally appeared in the Basmani court, looked, frankly, I thought, rather frightened. Implacable, fearless, holy warriors is certainly not the impression that they gave. And in the old days, as I said, I think ISIS would not have been happy about an appearance like that. I don't know about today's ISIS. I'm not still far from certain what sort of an organization today's ISIS actually is, now that it no longer claims to be the caliphate and doesn't have a caliph heading it. I'm not quite sure what its purpose and its rationale today is. But anyway, either the organization has degenerated significantly or there are unanswered questions about the particular role of these 4 men. Now, I have received a very useful email, an essential email, from an informed source who's told me that ISIS, as a matter of principle, has 2 types of fighters. They're the elite, highly motivated, highly trained fighters who are prepared to fight to the death, who do embrace martyrdom in these desperate situations. And then the others, who might be described as foot soldiers, who are given only perfunctory training, who are sometimes coerced into carrying out operations of that nature through threats to themselves or to their families, who are often bribed, often with small amounts, and who behave in an entirely different way. And I have no doubt that that is true. But given what a very high-profile attack in Moscow this was, one which ISIS must have known would attract global attention, I still find it surprising that ISIS would have delegated it to foot soldiers as opposed to elite fighters. Certainly, the appearance of those 4 men in the courtroom yesterday does not convey the image, as I said, that ISIS historically used to like to convey. It's also clear that these 4 men, as I discussed yesterday, are talking and that they're providing a significant amount of information to the Russian authorities. Now, there has been a great deal of discussion in the West about the fact that the FSB focused on Ukraine, took its eye off the ball, discounted the threat from Islamist terrorists, from ISIS-K specifically, that this is a major security lapse and an intelligence failure, and all of those things. Now, it might very well be true, by the way. It would be completely unsurprising if, given the raging conflict across the border in Ukraine, the FSB was primarily focused and had diverted most of its resources to dealing with the challenges posed by Ukraine. Having said that, I think that all of this commentary about the lapses of the FSB ignores something else, which is the success of the FSB in capturing these 4 people so fast and in wrapping up the terrorist cell through which they operated. And it is actually unusual. In fact, I don't remember another instance when this has happened. I'm not saying that it hasn't happened. I'm simply saying that I don't remember another instance where it has happened, where an entire cell, an entire network, and the gunmen who carried out an attack of this nature from one of the Islamist terrorist networks were arrested and captured so quickly after an incident took place. Now, that might suggest that the FSB was keeping an eye on some of these people before the incident took place, and that begs all kinds of questions. But it's also, it seems to me, possible that as soon as the incident happened, members of the Tajik community in Moscow, which to my knowledge is very substantial, probably contacted the Russian authorities and provided information about these people. Now, anybody who has been to Moscow will know that there are large numbers of Gastarbeiter, guest workers from Central Asia working there at any particular point in time. And many of them obviously come from Tajikistan. And their work in Moscow and in other Russian cities, indeed across Russia, is vital for the support of Tajikistan's economy and for the welfare of the families of these guest workers. The guest workers send large amounts of money in remittances to their families in their home country, in Tajikistan, in this case. And of course, these guest workers often have what, from their perspective, is very well-paid jobs in Moscow and in other big Russian cities. Overall, my impression has been, it's purely, an impression, but my impression has been that the relationship between the Central Asian communities and the Russians has generally been quite calm. When there have been problems in the past, and I haven't heard of problems, interethnic problems in Russia for a long time, but when there have been problems in the past, it's tended to be more between Russians and people from the Caucasus, not so much from people from Central Asia. And I would have thought, given the immense financial self-interest, that the vast majority of Tajiks in Moscow and in Russia would want it to stay that way. So I think it quite plausible that as soon as something like this happened, community leaders, I presume there are such people amongst the Tajik community in Moscow, would have been asking each other quickly, who could have done this thing? They would not have had much difficulty working it out, and they would have tipped off the FSB, and that probably facilitated the roundup. I'm just saying, one way or the other, whilst perhaps the FSB should be criticised for whatever intelligence and security lapses there were before the incident happened, I think in order to balance that, one ought to also recognize the fact that they seem to have got on top of the case very quickly. So that's one other thing I think I would quickly say. None of that takes us much further at the moment. The big unanswered question for me, the underlying mystery, is firstly, why did these people want to escape at all? Well, no doubt we'd be getting an explanation for that. But also, why did they think that they would be able to cross the border and escape into Ukraine? Now, President Putin, in his address to the Russian people, said that a window would have been opened on the border for these people to cross into Ukraine, and he said that as a fact. Perhaps these 4 arrested individuals have already provided information, or perhaps another way in which the Russian authorities might have had of locating these people is because they had information from some source, either on the border, within Russia, or within Ukraine perhaps, that these people were heading in that direction, and that the Russians already know about the kind of window on the border which was going to be opened. We'll just have to wait and see, and find out what exactly it is that the Russians are going to say, though I suspect we will probably learn about that within the next few days, or perhaps even hours. Now, there is one further point I want to make. The media in the West, as I said, has been very busy. There's been claims made that Putin remained silent for 24 hours after this attack took place, and that there's some kind of significance to be attached to this. There's claims that Putin was silent for 24 hours after the Prigozhin mutiny started. My own view is that Putin actually responded and went public in his address to the Russian people extremely fast. I haven't counted the number of hours. I don't personally think that most people in Russia think that he delayed in any way. That is one thing. The other thing that I do find a little concerning, in fact more than a little concerning, is the extent to which Western commentators and Western governments are going out of their way to insist that Ukraine was not involved in this affair. Now, the reason I find that strange is because, as of the time of making this video, the Russian authorities have not formally and officially said that the Ukrainian government, the Ukrainian authorities, the state of Ukraine was, in fact, involved in this affair. Various Russian officials have hinted at this. Maria Zakharova at the Foreign Ministry, Dmitry Medvedev, others like them. There's been much commentary and discussion about this in the Russian media, but the Russian media is a diverse and exuberant place. All sorts of theories and ideas get floated there. It doesn't necessarily mean that they have official sanction. Putin himself, all that he has said is that these 4 gunmen were escaping towards Ukraine, which is indisputably true, and that a window was going to be created on the border. The last, very suggestive, very indicative of possible Ukrainian involvement, but nonetheless stopping short of a statement that the Ukrainian authorities were involved. The investigation, of course, into this affair is still underway. So, given that the investigation is underway, given that it is the Russians who are examining these 4 gunmen, given that it is the Russians who have captured the other members of this terror network, given that the Russians have access to all the material, they're a little bit premature to be coming out and making statements saying that ISIS and only ISIS was involved and Ukraine was not involved. Would it not be more appropriate, in fact, to wait and see whether that allegation that Ukraine was involved is actually made, and then respond to it then, based on whatever evidence or claimed evidence the Russians provide? Maybe I'm being a little picky, but we have an expression in English about people protesting too much. And it does seem that by rushing to deny things, to deny something on Ukraine's behalf, before Ukraine is even accused, properly speaking, accused, Western officials and governments are perhaps protesting a little too much. Now, I've discussed before how Ukraine has been involved in all kinds of terrible things in Russia, not in Russia and within its own borders. We have some very strange people in Ukraine. Kirill Budanov, the military intelligence chief, is the type of person who we know from an interview in the Financial Times meets people in a darkened room with the shutters pulled down and the lights turned off, which, to be frank, I don't find especially reassuring. So maybe one does wonder whether all of these protests, all these denials, don't at some level conceal a worm of doubt somewhere that Ukraine, which the New York Times was telling us some weeks ago in connection with the activities of the CIA in Ukraine, has a habit of going rogue and doing things which the Americans at least say they disapprove of, whether perhaps some people in the West deep down are a little worried that perhaps the Ukrainians were involved in some way. I say that, let me make it clear that even if that fear does exist, it doesn't necessarily prove that that was so. We'll just have to wait and see. But anyway, the investigation is taking a very, very interesting and important turn. It is likely that the Russians, with the perpetrators in their control, will very soon be able to reconstruct the entire operation and probably identify at least some of the people behind it. Let's wait and see what exactly it is that they have to say. Now, I'm going to just wrap up with one or two further things. I see that the Western officials, or at least anonymous Western officials, continue to insist that warnings were indeed passed on to the Russians prior to this event. The Russians haven't confirmed that. They've hinted otherwise. I'm not going to waste time exploring this story. I don't have the information one way or the other. And yesterday I mentioned that there was a claim that one of these 4 gunmen had served in the Ukrainian army. I have no information whether or not that is true. And the names that were given for the 4 gunmen at the hearing in the Basmani court do not correspond, or at least so it seems to me, with the name given, the name I have seen, for the person who is supposed to have served in the Ukrainian army. Perhaps he's one of the 2 gunmen who were killed, or perhaps there's a misunderstanding, or perhaps there's another alias used, or perhaps the name is spelled in so many different ways that I'm confused about the name itself. I don't know. But I don't, for the moment, see what I would call conclusive corroboration about this story. I will finish with saying this. If the Russians do finally claim that Ukraine was involved in some way, then I am confident that however strong or not the evidence the Russians produce may be, the West will reject it. They will insist that it was, as they say, ISIS and ISIS alone. What evidence they have for that, what evidence the West has for that, of course, they will never fully share. But just saying, that's, I think, one thing. If, however, the Russians do accuse Ukraine of involvement, then based on things that President Putin has already said, I expect the consequences to be severe, and it is highly likely that the Russian authorities will take further measures to escalate still further the special military operation in Ukraine. In fact, given that sending an armed man across a country's border and have him conduct murderous violence there is an act of war, going back to what Dmitry Peskov, Putin's spokesman, was saying just a few days ago, it seems to me that in that kind of situation, we could finally see Russia move towards a formal state of war. Again, I'm not saying that will happen, but anyway, let's wait and see. Now, that's all I think I can say about this incident up to this point. As I said, there's a lot of, it's clear to me that there is a lot of misinformation going on. I'm wary, for example, about accepting the truth of these torture videos, which I want to stress I have not seen and have no intention of watching. I wouldn't be able to tell whether those videos are real or not, but as I said, I do know that these video footage can be distorted and manipulated in all kinds of ways, and without knowing the secure provenance of these videos, I would strongly hesitate before accepting them. Just saying. So I'm sure there's an awful lot of misinformation going on, but a legal process is underway. The men have been produced to the Basmani court. There's a criminal investigation underway. All the facts show that the Russians have all the pieces that they need in their hands to come to some kind of conclusions. And I think the best thing to do is to wait for those conclusions and to assess them then. So let's move on to other things, and staying obviously with the subject of Russia, which has dominated this work of this channel pretty much since its inception, we have now more dramatic news from the battlefronts in Ukraine. And I think dramatic news is the right word, because with every single passing day, it seems to me that we gradually approach the moment of crisis in this war. Now, over the last couple of days, there have been massive missile strikes by the Russians across Ukraine. One of those strikes was described by the Russian Defense Ministry itself as massive. 3 nights in a row, missile strikes took place, and last night, and rather early this morning, a 4th strike also appears to have taken place. And these are missile strikes, not drone strikes. Uranium-2 drone strikes take place every night, and in fact, as it happens, there appears to have been a very big uranium-2 drone strike on Odessa, on various facilities in Odessa again. The latest strike, perhaps in some ways, of all of the strikes that have taken place up to this point, the single most dramatic was a missile strike on Zhytomyr airport near Kiev, which apparently happened in daylight. And the story that we're hearing is that an air raid alarm suddenly came on, this is during the day, and then 10 seconds later, in other words, barely any time later, massive explosions, 3 massive explosions, could be heard coming from the airport. Now, this airport is the location where Ukraine and the United States have positioned the Patriot missile launchers that the United States has delivered to Ukraine. And these Patriot missile launchers are specifically tasked with the defense of Kiev. Now, there are different types of Patriot missiles. There are Patriot missiles that are primarily tasked with shooting down aircraft, and there are other Patriot missiles, more sophisticated, which are tasked with shooting down missiles. Now, my understanding is that the Patriot missile launchers, which we've been seeing trundling across the Ukrainian countryside near the conflict line, which the Russians have been systematically destroying, and of which the Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu has said 5 have been destroyed over the course of the last month. Well, as I understand it, these are the older Patriot missile launchers launching the older types of Patriot missiles, which are primarily tasked with shooting down aircraft. And most of these launchers apparently have been supplied to Ukraine by the European states, specifically Germany and the Netherlands. The Patriot system, which the United States has supplied to Ukraine, is by contrast the more advanced and more modern Patriot system. It has the missiles that are tasked with shooting down missiles, and it is the missile system that is based at Zhytomyr airport near Kiev. Now, the Russians have previously attacked this Patriot system at Zhytomyr airport with Kinzhal hypersonic missiles. There were all kinds of claims of the Ukrainians that they were able to shoot down the Kinzhal missiles. The United States then grudgingly admitted that one of the launchers had been damaged during the strike, though it then went on to say that the damage had been repaired. There were conflicting claims about whether or not the missile system in its entirety had been destroyed. The Russians said it had been. The Americans denied it. But anyway, whatever, that attack took place many months ago, and it's clear that more Patriot missile launchers, or perhaps the same missile launchers, have been there since, providing some kind of air defense cover for Kiev. Now, the strike that took place early this morning appears to have targeted specifically these advanced Patriot missile launchers with the advanced missiles used to shoot down missiles, and which have been supplied by the United States. And reports have been trickling in over the course of the day, which suggests that, in fact, 2 launchers have been completely destroyed in this attack, and that the entire Patriot missile system has been taken out of action. Now, I want to say again, I can't confirm that this is true, but there are a number of rather interesting facts about this attack, one of which is the warning time between the attack itself and the ringing of the alarm sirens across Kiev appears to have been no more than 10 seconds. And this has set off lots of discussion as to how this could have been possible. The assumption is that the missiles that were used against the Patriot launchers at the Juleni base were hypersonic, and of course the hypersonic missile that is most widely used in the conflict is the Kinjal, and the Kinjal is typically launched from MiG-31 fighter jets flying at very high altitudes. And the Ukrainians have difficulties, apparently, tracking the missiles themselves until they come close to the target, because there's a sort of plasma field that builds around the missile whilst it functions at hypersonic speeds. Apparently the plasma field absorbs radar emissions. I'm not an expert on this, but this is what I have been told, which makes missiles, hypersonic missiles, largely invisible to radar. But the Ukrainians can track the MiG-31s. They're actually big aircraft flying at supersonic speeds and at very high altitudes. And usually the Ukrainians are alerted to the fact that a hypersonic Kinjal missile is on the way, because they're able to track the fact that these MiG-31s are operating. Now, this doesn't seem to have happened on this occasion, and one wonders why. Could it be that the Russians have been successful in knocking out some of the early warning radars? Or could it be that the missile that struck the airport and destroyed the Patriots was not a Kinjal, or rather were not Kinjals? About 2 weeks ago, President Putin, in his presidential address to the State Duma, said that the Russians had combat tested the new Zircon hypersonic cruise missile in Ukraine. Now, the Zircon operates in a completely different way from the Kinjal. It is presumably ground-launched. It uses an air-breathing scramjet engine. I'm not going to discuss the technical aspects. It functions in a completely different way. And of course, if it's ground launched, as I presume it is, you probably wouldn't have the telltale signs of a aircraft, a MiG-31, flying up to alert you that it was about to be launched in your direction. So perhaps, just possibly, maybe, just saying, my speculation, I haven't seen others suggest it, but the Russians actually used Zircon missiles to destroy these Patriot systems at Jeleni Airport. Obviously, they're not telling us that. It will be very interesting to see what the next Russian Defense Ministry update says. If it was the Zircon, then this is a very, very serious escalation. Now, alongside the use of the Zircon missiles or Kinjal missiles or whatever it was, we're also getting reports that on Onyx supersonic anti-ship missiles, but which are also possess a secondary land attack capability, have also been used by the Russians over the last couple of hours, possibly on strikes on Odessa. And anyway, the overall story again is of the Russians launching missile attacks across Ukraine without the Ukrainian air defense system being able to function. And in fact, earlier today, there was another plea from Ukraine for more air defense interceptors. They're desperately short of these, and their air defense system is barely functioning, or so it seems. We're also getting more reports about what those earlier strikes managed to do. It seems that over the course of the very first strike, the one that happened a couple of days ago, the Russians were targeting facilities of Ukrainian military intelligence, the organization headed by Kirill Budanov. Over the course of subsequent strikes, the Russians also appear to have been striking at facilities controlled by Ukraine's internal security service, the SBU, which, by the way, originated as the regional branch of the Soviet KGB at the time when Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union. Just saying. We have also seen reports that the Russians did significant damage to some of the equipment, some of the power generating equipment close to an important dam on the Dnieper River. They appear to have done massive damage to the energy system, Ukraine's energy system. This strike on the energy system appears to have been far more damaging than any single strike carried out by the Russians against the energy system in the missile strikes that the Russians conducted against the energy system in 2022-2023. Much of Kharkiv city remains without power. There are reports that the Ukrainian electricity provider has lost something like 50% of its capacity over the course of one single strike, which seems astonishing. And anyway, it does seem to have been a devastating attack on Ukraine's energy system. We've also had reports, which I discussed in another program, that the Russians have launched a major strike against an air base intended eventually to host F-16 fighter jets when they eventually reach Ukraine sometime in the summer. And lastly, we've also heard reports that an attack was carried out using uranium-2 drones on a gigantic gas storage facility on Ukrainian territory, the biggest in Europe, which apparently is used by the European Union to store much of the gas that is needed to supply European consumers with gas. And it seems that the destruction of this facility, should it take place, would have a very negative effect on the energy situation in Europe, which is already, to say it straightforwardly, far from good. Anyway, major Russian missile strikes overall. Ukraine, as I discussed in my program yesterday, conducted a strike of its own against Crimea. I mentioned that they claimed that they at least damaged, or perhaps even sunk, 2 Russian warships in Sevastopol harbor. Satellite pictures that have appeared do not appear to confirm this. The ships appear to be still there. There's no clear evidence of damage. I'm not able to examine the satellite photos myself, but that seems to be the view that most people have. In which case, this entire missile strike on Crimea was a failure, and an expensive failure, with up to 11 Storm Shadow and Scalp missiles lost, and some reports, not confirmed so far by the Russian Defense Ministry, that 2 Sukhoi 24 jets, the jets that launch the Storm Shadows, have been lost as well. Anyway, all of this is bad for Ukraine, but the situation on the front lines, if anything, is becoming dramatically worse. Now, I've discussed the situation in many recent programs, but it is now, I think, becoming clear, at least to me, that the proximate objective of the Russians is to punch a hole through the center of the line of contact. In other words, the precise place where the Ukrainian defenses in Donbass were strongest, which is in central Donbass. And we see a sustained Russian offensive in the area from Marinka in the south all the way up to Siversk in the north. There is fighting going on further south in Zaporozhye and Kherson, and there's also fighting going on further north around Kupiansk, but it is on a much lower level of intensity. In Zaporozhye region, by the way, we're getting that the Russian information that the Russians now control most of Rabotino and have consolidated control of it, and that they've captured most of the fields around Rabotino. And there are suggestions that the Ukrainians might soon be surrounded if they continue to try to cling on to the areas in the north of Rabotino that they still control. Well, those are the reports, obviously. I can't confirm those. Whilst in the Kupiansk area, we have these complicated positional battles, as they're called, around Sinkovka. The Russians don't seem to have made serious attempts to capture Sinkovka since the autumn. They came all the way up to Sinkovka, within sight, apparently, of Kupiansk itself, and then they stopped, keeping the Ukrainians guessing about what they intended to do. And in the meantime, Ukraine has had to position large numbers of its forces around Kupiansk, where they continue to suffer very heavy losses from Russian bomb attacks and drone attacks and missile attacks, even as the Russians get on with the main axis of their offensive, which is in this area in the center. And over the course of last night, all of the mappers, Russian, Ukrainian, pro-Russian, pro-Ukrainian, neutral, have been adjusting their maps in the Avdiivka and Bakhmut areas, principally, all of them showing what looked like increasingly rapid Russian advances. And the map of the Russian advances around Avdiivka shows the Russians now gradually enveloping Pervomaisky, town of 28,000 people from the north. There's a report that the Russians have advanced within Pervomaisky itself, that they've now taken control of the center of the town. Center is an ambiguous word here. Pervomaisky is one of these long, thin towns. Apparently the center is actually somewhat to the west of the main central position. It's presumably the most built-up area where the churches and the civic buildings are located. Anyway, the Russians are supposed to be either in control of that area now or gaining control of it. But more importantly, they're now advancing from Tonenka and are gaining control of the territory immediately to the north, and they're also in the process of gaining control of the territory immediately to the south as a result of their capture about 10 days ago of the village of Nivolskoye. So Pervomaisky, close to being taken into a tight semicircle. The Ukrainians already have lost a significant part of this town. It looks like the town is probably close to falling. And in the Bakhmut area, the reports now speak of the Russians being in the outskirts of Chasiv Yar, at least Chasiv Yar, west of the canal, and also close to cutting off the lines of retreat and supply to the Ukrainian troops trying to hold the positions southwest of Bakhmut in places like Klashevka and Andreevka. Now, the last, by the way, must be a particularly bitter blow for the Ukrainians and for their new overall military commander, General Syrsky, because over the course of the summer, alongside the offensive in Zaporozhye, the one that attracted all the attention, the Ukrainians also launched an offensive in the Bakhmut area. And the main focus of that offensive was the area to the southwest of Bakhmut. The Ukrainians made massive efforts to capture Andreevka and Klashevka, and they sought to press on beyond a railway line and to capture the fortified village of Kurdyumovka, a more heavily industrial village, by the way, than some of these other places. The idea was that if they captured Kurdyumovka, then they would be able to start to sever Russian supply lines to Bakhmut and would achieve General Syrsky's objective of taking Bakhmut into a semicircle. Well, that operation failed, and now it's going catastrophically into reverse. The Ukrainian troops who advanced into this area last summer now risk being cut off. And the likelihood is that they're going to have to withdraw rapidly towards Chasiv Yar in order to avoid being cut off. So, a situation in Bakhmut where Chasiv Yar is being threatened, and where the Russians look like they're poised to take control of the entire territory to the west of the canal. Now, in one of his most recent videos, Dima at the Military Summary channel spoke about a very bold and rather complex Russian maneuver that took place over the course of yesterday, which the Russians carried out in the northwest area of Bakhmut, which apparently now endangers the supply line of the Ukrainian troops who are still holding out in Bogdanovka. And it could be, if this is correct, which I presume it is, that Bogdanovka, this other village, is also about to fall, which, if correct, will further increase the pressure on Chasiv Yar. Now, all of these advances by the Russians are continuing to happen, even as Russian forces get more powerful and become stronger all the time. I'm not going to repeat the many things I've said about this, but suffice to say that yesterday I saw reports again that the Russians are now close to starting to deploy drone swarms over the Ukrainian battlefields, swarms of kamikaze drones operating on AI, able therefore to attack, notwithstanding whatever jamming systems the Ukrainians are operating, adding a further advantage to the Russian forces. And I'm also, by the way, reading that over the last few weeks, exactly as I discussed some time ago, Russian electronic warfare systems have been upgraded steadily, and there was a report recently that only 20% of Ukrainian kamikaze drones get through, and apparently that proportion is continuing to fall. And there's other reports of all sorts of other Russian weapons coming on the scene as well. I discussed some time ago the likely appearance before long of the new precision-guided FAB 3000 missiles, whose weight of explosive is 1.5 tons. So, lots of things happening as the Russians grow stronger. But the key thing is that the Ukrainians are continuing to grow weaker. We've discussed ammunition shortages. We've discussed, we'll discuss in this program, problems the Ukrainians are having with drones. There's been an article in the American media, I think it is in the Washington Post, which says that the Ukrainians are finding it all but impossible to mobilize the manpower that they need, that given the enormous resistance now within the Ukrainian society to the draft, with more and more young Ukrainian men seeing passage to the army as essentially a death sentence in a defeated cause. More and more Ukrainian men are unwilling to enlist, and the recruitment, or rather conscription, has as a result become extremely patchy, with no likelihood that the mobilization law, which is still stuck, by the way, in the Ukrainian parliament, is going to change that situation to any significant degree. So things, it seems to me, are accelerating we see the Russians conducting these enormously sophisticated strikes across the battlefronts. We see these strikes involving multiple missiles, types of missiles. It's no longer a case, as it was in the winter of 2022, 2023, of the strikes being carried out by subsonic missiles, subsonic cruise missiles, KH-101s, and Calibra missiles launched from the ships of the Black Sea Fleet. It's now lots of different types of missiles, Kinzhals, Onyxes, KH-101s and Calibras, Iskander missiles, increasingly used in strikes of this kind, Kinzhal hypersonic missiles, perhaps Zircon missiles as well. Lots of different types of drones, Russian anti-radar missiles, KH-31s, missiles moving in different directions, carrying out hairpin turns, Uranium-2s circling the night sky over Ukrainian cities, drawing the Ukrainian air defense system upon themselves. Russian observation of all of these events through their complex array of satellites and drones able to track and identify the locations of Ukrainian air defense assets and respond to them. And of course, the same is true increasingly of the situation on the battlefronts. I am starting to wonder how much longer this is going to continue for. The Russians, it seems to me, are getting closer and closer to breaking the Battle of Donbass. I've discussed in previous programs the unusual topography of Donbass, the soft ground, the rivers, the forests, the density of population centres, all of which works to the advantage of the defender over the attacker. But of course, the further west one moves, the thinner the population density becomes, the urban densities become, the more open the ground. And I think we're already starting to see that. The amount of fortified territory, or readily fortified territory, which exists in Donbass and which is available to Ukraine, is shrinking. And Ukraine is running out of operational space, even as it runs out of troops and it runs out of machines. And as I've said many times in many programs, if the Russians do complete the Battle of Donbass, based on what others have said, people like David Glantz, Jacques Beau, it will be very difficult for Ukraine to build analogous defense positions in other places. So I'm starting to wonder whether, given the trends, we might be closer to the end, or at least the end game, than we realize. Perhaps the Ukrainians themselves have come to this conclusion. Now, about a week ago, at the time of the Ukrainian attacks on Belgorod and Kursk region, I received a series of emails from a very valued source who was telling me that the primary objective of the Ukrainian attacks in Belgorod was to capture Belgorod 22, a base near Belgorod where the Russians stored tactical nuclear weapons. And I admit that I was initially somewhat taken aback by this claim. It seemed to me an astonishingly reckless and desperate thing for the Ukrainians to want to do. But anyway, since all of those discussions, I've noticed that there was an article in Newsweek, of all places, which effectively confirmed this. It says Russian rebels raid settlements just 10 miles from nuclear storage site. And it goes into huge detail. It describes the base where these nuclear weapons were stored. It refers to the base as Belgorod 22, though apparently that is not its official title. Its official title is Military Unit 25624 of Russia's 12th Chief Directorate. Just saying. There is some debate about whether nuclear weapons are indeed still stored in that facility. My source said they were. The source in Newsweek denies this. Given that my source was right, both about this facility and about the fact that the Ukrainian soldiers were in close proximity to it, I am going to assume that he was right about the presence of those nuclear weapons at this location, at this place, and about the desire by the Ukrainians to capture it. All of this, I have to say, I find quite incredible. And I think the best comment about it has been made by Stephen Bryan at Asia Times. He's written about the current state of the war. Stephen Bryan, I should say, is one of the most insightful commentators I know about the war. Anyway, he's written about it, and he's actually straightforwardly come out and said that the Ukrainians were indeed attempting to capture this facility, and that doing so demonstrates how desperate they've become, that they're becoming more desperate and more reckless. And this, it seems to me, could be the story of the whole operation in Belgorod and Kursk region in its entirety, but it could also be the story of many other things that we're increasingly seeing in Ukraine. I have to say, I think he's right, and one does wonder again what the Ukrainians intend to do once that desperation changes and turns to outright despair. Now, a short time ago, I said that I think it would be a good idea if the Western powers started to come up with plans, contingency plans, for rapid evacuations of their embassies and people from Kiev and other places. And that made a lot more sense to me than any plans to deploy troops to Ukraine. On the subject of deploying troops to Ukraine by the Western powers, I should say that Pepe Escobar has claimed, on the basis of an information given by a European source, that there was a movement of European troops, French, German, and others, to the town of Cherkasy. I've seen no evidence to corroborate that, and I'm skeptical as of this moment about that claim. I'm sure if it were true, the Russians would know about it, and we would have heard about it from those sources. But anyway, putting that aside, I think This is not the moment for harebrained schemes about sending troops to Ukraine. Stephen Bryan trashes that idea in his latest article in Asia Times. What I do think it would be much wiser and more appropriate to do at this time is, on the contrary, to think hard about a likely evacuation. And of course, the destruction of the Patriot launchers at the Zheleny airport defending Kiev ought itself perhaps to ask, to beg questions. If the Russians are trying to destroy the air defense systems that have been defending Kiev, why are they doing it at this time? Could it be that some big missile and air offensive against Kiev is coming? Could it be that that missile and air offensive will be combined perhaps with a ground offensive as well? I'm not saying that is the case. I don't know. How will the Ukrainians respond to that, with their army already stretched to breaking point and the Russians punching a massive hole through their main defense lines in Donbass? How will some of the very fervid people in Kiev respond if they feel that Ukraine's time is running out? I think Western governments ought to be thinking hard about these things. I think Western presidents and prime ministers and chancellors ought to be thinking about it too. I see no sign that they are. I hope about that I am wrong. Anyway, that is what I think. This is where I end my program today. As I said, we will get more information of this, I am sure, about the Crocus City Hall attack within the next few hours or days. But in the meantime, this is where I end my program. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble, and X. You can also, please remember also that you can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. You can also check out our shop, where you can find all sorts of amazing things. Today, 25th March, is, by the way, Greek Independence Day. We have some items in our shop, some wonderful items in our shop commemorating that event. This is your opportunity to buy them on the day itself. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you again. More from me soon. Have a very good day.